He is sometimes called the Black Spartacus, the Black George Washington, or the Black Napoleon. Toussaint Louverture. Maybe Napoleon was the white Toussaint Louverture. He defeated with his army of ex-slaves the three colonial powers France, Spain, and England, led the only successful slave revolt in the history of mankind, and is considered the embodiment of both the Haitian independence and the French Revolution. Despite his services to humanity, he was not to see the fruits of his efforts, as he was to find himself a powerful enemy. Today, your history folks would like to take you to the Caribbean of the 18th century and introduce you to one of the most remarkable historical figures of all time. The year is 1789. In the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the French citizens revolt against the absolutist regime of Louis XVI, as a result of which the National Assembly is founded in Paris. All of a sudden, the idea that everyone was equal from birth and had rights was spoken of at the state level. This was literally revolutionary. A shockwave swept across the Atlantic, reaching as far as the French colonies overseas, which was to cause the hierarchy to be turned upside down in the most brutal way. Until then, the system of the colonial powers was based on the principle of inequality, from which only a small white minority benefited. Saint-Domingue, as Haiti was then called, was soon to be no longer what it was. The Pearl of the Antilles, the western part of the island of Hispaniola, was then the richest of all France's overseas possessions. Most of the sugar that was so popular in Europe came from the plantations here, as well as half of the coffee shipped worldwide. Wealth and splendor, however, were based on the worst form of class hierarchy, slavery. By the end of the 18th century, there were 500,000 slaves in the colony, most of them from Africa. Every year, 30,000 new ones arrived as replacements because many could not withstand the cruel conditions. It is a mixture full of conflict. The whites are divided into small and large settlers, and differ in size of possessions and the rights that go with them. In addition, there is the black majority, of which about 1% have been able to gain freedom, but they suffered discrimination just as much as the class of the free mixed-race population. In this class system based on inequality, the white could only enforce their supremacy with brutal force. In this reign of terror, slaves lived under the most horrible conditions. If their owner was dissatisfied with their work or simply in a bad mood, the punishments were draconian. So it was common practice to rub chili powder into the wounds of the whip, or one let them hang until death at a tree or cut off their limbs. But now the hour of revenge had struck. There were already a few resistance movements united by the common voodoo beliefs brought from Africa, such as the Maroons, runaway slaves who fled into the jungle. On August the 21st, 1791, the rebels met and planned their rebellion, demanding nothing but independence. The morning after the next, they strike out, murdering whites and setting factories on fire. To regain their freedom, they had to proceed with the same cruelty they had suffered. More than 20,000 rebels joined the movement within a month. The war has now begun. Where is Toussaint Louverture now, you may be asking? Well, at the time of the outbreak of the rebellion, Toussaint was not one of the slaves. In fact, he was free and owned plantations and a few slaves himself. So why does he now decide to go into battle with them? Where does the solidarity with the oppressed come from? Toussaint's beginnings could not be more humble. He was born in 1743 into a slave family of West African descent. His father was reportedly a prince from the Alada kingdom in Benin until he was enslaved and sold on a slave ship to the Caribbean to toil on French plantation. Toussaint was lucky to learn to read and write. The owner of the plantation was relatively liberal. How liberal you can be when you call people your property. The rather weak boy later becomes a model athlete. He has a special talent for riding, a talent that will later serve him well in the war. But first he works as a coachman on the plantation until he has the extraordinary luck to gain his freedom at the age of 34. I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man. He then becomes a businessman and landowner himself, spending his days on the plantation until the age of 48, reading through the great works of history and probably stumbling upon Renard and Diderot's Histoire philosophique des deux Indes, a groundbreaking indictment of European colonialism and barbaric slavery. The two authors warned Europeans that if they continued to massacre, chain and plunder indigenous populations, an avenger, a kind of Spartacus, would arise to put a violent end to the practice of human enslavement. So it may have been this reading that now drives Toussaint to drop everything, to give up his family, his possessions, to risk his freedom and his life to be the avenger his people now need. And so Toussaint now joins the rebels, just as the conflict was escalating into a war of extermination. The whites, in fact, were soon beating back the rebels with all their force. Dead bodies lay everywhere in the field, and the heads of the whites were left impaled on the roadside for all to see. 4 months after the beginning of the conflict, France sends another 10,000 soldiers to Saint-Domingue to finally put down the slave uprising. Toussaint, meanwhile, has risen in the ranks of the rebels thanks to his intelligence, experience, and horsemanship. And so it is decided that Toussaint should lead the negotiations for an agreement with the white planters. Toussaint is not a violence-loving person, and for this occasion he drafts a peace, or rather surrender declaration. However, the negotiations with the white planters went differently than expected. In fact, they now saw themselves in the role of victims, forgetting the deeds of the last 300 years and thirsted for revenge. In retaliation, they rejected Toussaint's peace offer. So the fighting continued, and Toussaint, as a clever strategist, made it to the top of the army after 2 years. By now, he also had his nickname Louverture because he found openings in the enemy's ranks that no one else saw. He was also known for suddenly appearing in one place and then disappearing again, which is why he was said to have magical powers. In 1793, he addressed the public with the following words: "I am Toussaint Louverture. My name is perhaps known to you. I have undertaken to avenge you. I want liberty and equality to reign throughout Saint-Domingue. I am working toward that end. Come and join me, brothers, and combat by our side for the same cause." Louverture, the strategist, also directed this to the Spaniards. He knew about the war in Europe, and so he forged an alliance with the Spanish in the neighboring colony against the French. The Iberians owned Santo Domingo in the east of the island. The Spanish supplied the rebels with weapons, and in return the monarchy hoped to conquer Saint-Domingue. Thanks to this alliance, the fighters managed to conquer more and more towns. The French of the island feared the worst and turned to England for help. The British sent 25,000 soldiers against the slave army. So now the three major imperial powers, France, Spain, and England, and an army of ex-slaves fight for control of Saint-Domingue. The latter, however, has the decisive advantage of its leaders, Toussaint Louverture and his comrade in arms Jean-Jacques Dessalines. The former slave Dessalines brings ruthlessness, intransigence, intelligence, and a yearning for revenge. Along with Louverture, he is the decisive figure in the fight for freedom. Together they will lead and win the unequal fight against the European. In 1794, news reaches Louverture that will change everything. The National Convention in France has abolished slavery. Over 1 million former slaves are now French citizens. This is mainly thanks to Louverture and Dessalines. Now, however, the two leaders had to quickly change strategy. Without further ado, the back was turned to the ally Spain, and after 3 years they were again on the side of France. From then on, Louverture, Dessalines, and their army of ex-slaves fought successfully against Spain and even drove out the British. The Europeans did not like the news from overseas at all. A black general defeating white European armies one after another. If this spreads to the other possessions, it could collapse the whole colonial system. They must act. Louverture sees the impending danger from Europe and tries to rebuild Saint-Domingue as quickly as possible. The economic strength of the country lay in the export of sugar, coffee, cocoa, etc. And so Louverture wanted to send his people back to the plantations to produce for Europe. Understandably, however, they did not want to do this. They preferred to produce for themselves and had just thrown off the European shackles. Louverture had no choice and forced them back onto the plantations with the help of Dessalines and using a lot of violence. Louverture also created an autonomous constitution for Saint-Domingue, in which he stated that slavery was forever abolished on the island. The constitution also contained a ban on discrimination based on skin color, a historic law that would only find its way into the US 150 years later. At the same time, he declared himself governor for life. This legacy of a military dictatorship will accompany the country for the next 2 centuries. Louverture did not plan to relinquish leadership for the time being. That was now finally too much for the Europeans and Americans. They must prevent a black republic by all means. There was one in particular who did not like this at all: Napoleon Bonaparte, who came to power in 1799. In fact, the two opponents, Napoleon and Louverture, have much in common. Both come from unusual backgrounds, managed their military rise from nothing, became brilliant army leaders, and finally political figures. But despite the similarities, Napoleon is no friend of liberation movements. and is a racist to the core. My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint-Domingue is not so much based on considerations of commerce and money as on the need to block forever the march of the blacks in the world. In 1802, Napoleon sends a massive fleet to Saint-Domingue. In all, over 60,000 French soldiers will arrive. Louverture is able to withstand the French troops for 3 months, but on May 6, 1802, he is forced to surrender. He hopes to be judged by a military tribunal, as would normally be the case, so he boards a ship bound for France. He will never see his homeland again. In the meantime, Dessalines continues to collaborate alongside the French delegate Leclerc, a brother-in-law of Napoleon. But soon the frightening news arrives from the neighboring island of Guadeloupe. Napoleon has reintroduced slavery here. Their worst fears threaten to come true. Dessalines immediately breaks the alliance with the French. The army of the ex-slaves is now once again taking up arms against the French colonial power. Under the leadership of Dessalines, a brutal and uncompromising field campaign against the whites begins. The cities are burned down and a large part of the whites are murdered. What Dessalines' troops did not get their hands on, the yellow fever wiped out. And so, in 1803, the unbelievable happens. The French soldiers retreat. The revolutionaries have won. Napoleon's army, though undefeated in Europe, was defeated in the Caribbean by an army of ex-slaves. On January 1st, 1804, after 12 years of war, Dessalines solemnly proclaimed the independence of the country, which would from then on be called Haiti. After Haiti, the land of the high mountains, that's what the original population of the island called it, before the Taíno were completely wiped out after the arrival of Columbus. Only in Haiti did slaves manage to resist the colonial powers and create their own state. Toussaint Louverture unfortunately did not live to see this day. After arriving in France by ship, he was locked up in an isolated prison. He died here as a result of the harsh conditions of imprisonment on April 7, 1803, a few months before Haiti's independence. Louverture can be credited with so much, not just the Haitian independence and the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. He caught the shockwave of the French Revolution, implemented it, and sent it back across the Atlantic, where it became emblematic for the quest for freedom. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in other freedom fighters in history, please click here.